Okay, so that is the future, and you just better pray in an emergency that they do get the mobile network up quickly, because that'll be the bugbear if they don't.
And that's the big learning from both Christchurch and Kaikoura in particular, is how much we do rely on the mobile networks. And so the telcos are very aware of the fact that that's going to be their first priority in an emergency situation.
All right, nice to talk to you.
Just while you're there, is it true that it's not just the power, it gets overloaded? Because after the quakes, it all went down, but it wasn't just power, it was the fact that the system was overloaded. So whenever an emergency happens, it's probably going to happen in terms of the inability to communicate, just because the cell phone towers can't handle it. Is that true or untrue?
That can be true. I mean, a mobile network is what we call a contended network, which means that if you're the only person connected to the tower at any one time, you get all of the capability the tower has, but as soon as the second person comes on, your capability halves. So the more people that are trying to connect, the less there is. But since then, we've had the rollout of 4G and we've got 5G coming, and the factors that occur with those new technologies is that they can deal a lot better with mass connections at any one time. But again, it does come back to you're probably better to text if you can, just because it's a lower overhead on the network. Sorry about the technical side of it.
No, it's good to know.
Craig, thank you. Craig Young from Tuans. Just before we go, the Western world's begun to go gangbusters with burgeoning cannabis industries, and already, Alexia, this headline in the Toronto Star: women cite glass ceiling in male-dominated weed industry. Isn't that amazing already?
Are women too sensible to get into the weed industry? That must be a high ceiling.
It should be grass ceiling anyway, shouldn't it, really? Anyway, cannabis law reform here is in prospect. It's looming in Canada, and overseas it's becoming big money. This is what I want to ask you. Corona Beer, investing in the Canadian cannabis company Canopy Growth, has seen its share value grow by $4 billion. Just because Corona's getting on board. And investors are betting that Corona will launch cannabis-based drinks. Meanwhile, The Atlantic reports more and more Americans are reporting near constant cannabis use as legalisation goes ahead. Public health experts are a bit worried about this and the striking number of constant users. And the Journal of the American Medical Association reports growing use among pregnant women, presumably to help with morning sickness. Where do you stand on this? I mean, I imagine that even the supporters of reform don't want to create something that goes out of control. Would you want the government to keep a tight lid here? Or do you think a lid can be kept on it? What do you think?
I'm very torn on this subject. I know there are so many people who say it's inevitable, it's happening overseas, we have to, do something, we have to decriminalise it. But at the back of my mind is that lecture that we got given at intermediate school about drug use and using, things that alter your mind and alter your brain cells. And, I mean, the whole idea of using it in for morning sickness appalls me. And I just wonder if it's like the telecommunication wave. There's these big waves that come over and we embrace it, but there's something that gets left behind. There are problems that get thrown up on the beach.
All right. I better leave the last word to Dwayne with an eye on the clock.
Yes, well, I've got lots of friends who are quite keen on this legalisation, but I just don't want it to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. I'd love if we did come in, have some kind of review. I look at the alcohol equivalent, and sometimes I use it as an excuse, but I'd love to see some of those statistics, like 668, come down, or some of the alcohol statistics come down before we just pile into a cannabis environment in New Zealand.
Right. Good on you, Dwayne. Thank you. Dwayne Major, Alexia Russell, and that's the panel for the week.
Tō maira e hoa mā he kōrero, kei te haere hei kaupapa, kei te karawhia. Welcome to Checkpoint. What a day in politics. Australia is set to have its fifth Prime Minister in 5 years. We go to Canberra. We've got lots on that. The Prime Minister has sacked Clare Curran from Cabinet. She's also lost portfolios. We've just spoken to the Prime Minister. That will be first up tonight. New Zealand's largest... So we've got the same promo there as last night. We're also going to look at the leak, Simon Bridges, and what is happening in National and why the inquiry has been suspended. And a staggering statistic, 668 people took their own lives in this country in the past year. What on earth is going on?
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, good afternoon. Ko Katrina Batanaho. The Prime Minister has removed one of her ministers, Clare Curran, from the Cabinet. Jacinda Ardern says Ms Curran has lost her government digital services portfolio and her open government responsibilities after she failed a second time to properly declare a meeting. That meeting was in February with the tech entrepreneur Derek Handley, who was interested in the government's vacant role of Chief Technology Officer. But Ms Ardern says the meeting wasn't recorded in Ms Curran's diary and her staff and officials weren't made aware of it. It was subsequently left out of an answer to a recent written parliamentary question. Ms Ardern says that's not good enough.
That creates an impression and a perception that lacks transparency, and that is not something that I will tolerate, particularly from a Minister for Open Government.
Jacinda Ardern says Ms Curran will keep her broadcasting portfolio. Ms Curran came under fire earlier this year after she failed to disclose a meeting with RNZ's former head of news, Carol Hirschfeld. Speaking in Dunedin in the last few minutes, Clare Curran said she was very sorry for what has happened. She says she's let herself, the Prime Minister and the government down. Ms Curran says she wants to put her head down and focus on her broadcasting portfolio. The National Party says that the Speaker of the House has cast a pall over the whole caucus in deciding to halt an inquiry into the leak of the leader's travel expenses. Trevor Mallard has pulled the plug on the investigation he initially ordered, saying it's now a matter for National to deal with, as it's likely someone in the party is the person responsible. Shadow Leader of the House, Jerry Brownlee, says he's appalled by Mr Mallard's actions and says it's not for him to decide that the inquiry shouldn't continue.
That's Mr Mallard turning his finger on the opposition, the 56 MPs, almost half the Parliament who make up the National Party, and saying, you are guilty. It is appalling behaviour from him.
Senior National MP Jerry Brownlee. The outgoing Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull, counts record job growth and substantial tax reforms among his government's achievements in the past 3 years. Mr Turnbull was today ousted from the Liberal Party leadership, with former Treasurer Scott Morrison taking over as the new Prime Minister. In a news conference following the vote, he told reporters he was proud of his government's record in boosting the country's economy.
The foundation of everything you do in government is a strong economy, and we have delivered as we promised. We've got record jobs growth in Australia last year. We have strong economic growth, 3.1%, as you know, higher than any of the G7 economies.
Malcolm Turnbull says the personal income tax reforms his government has achieved are the biggest anyone has seen in 20 years. Efforts to fix a power pole in Dunedin this week has been labelled as a PR exercise. Pole 84194 in the suburb of Green Island is rotten on a precarious lean and is loaded with high voltage equipment and right next to a school, a busy main street and a pub. After media coverage this week, a concrete block was placed at the base of the pole and a $250,000 crane truck attached to the top. Richard Healy, a former employee of lines company Aurora, says the concrete block is nothing more than a PR exercise.
It looks really good when you've got a big heavy concrete block strapped to the bottom of the pole. So this isn't about reducing risk, this is about addressing public perception.
Richard Healy, lines company Aurora, says the pole will be replaced next week. Green Party MP Chloe Swarbrick says the taboo around talking about mental health needs to change. Suicide figures released by the Chief Coroner today found 668 people died by suicide over the past year, with 20 to 24-year-olds being the most at risk. Chloe Swarbrick says it's important that she, as an MP, has openly spoken about her mental health history as it normalises the problem.
It's by no means a sign of weakness. It's a part of life. We have all of the stats and research that show that a majority of people are going to be impacted by mental health issues themselves, if not by those of their friends and whānau in their lives.
Chloe Swarbrick says mental health needs to be treated as a crisis and the under-25s need to be able to get free counselling. It's 5 minutes past 5. Sport, the All Blacks are playing down any injury concern about Sam Cane, despite the open side flanker sitting out today's training ahead of tomorrow's second Bledisloe Cup test against Australia in Auckland. Cane watched on as the All Blacks went through their final preparations at Eden Park this afternoon, but All Blacks skipper Kieran Reid expects Cane to take the field tomorrow night.
He's just precautionary, I think, just having a day off today, so at the moment he's still going to go.
Meanwhile, Taranaki have their first Ranfurly Shield defence of the season when they play Manawatu tonight. The Warriors can book their place in the National Rugby League finals for the first time since 2011 if they can beat the Penrith Panthers in Auckland tonight. Lose and they could face a nerve-wracking final round match against Canberra. A run of yo-yo performances, including a surprise loss to the Bulldogs last round, have stopped the Warriors from already sealing a top 8 finish. And the end-of-year Rugby League test between Australia and Tonga in Auckland is reportedly close to being given the green light, with an announcement expected next week. The all-white striker Chris Wood scored from the penalty spot, but his English club side Burnley were beaten 3-1 by Greek side Olympiakos in the first leg of their Europa League qualifying tie in Athens. That's the news.
Kia ora, g'day, Paul Brennan on Nights from 7 tonight. It's Friday, which means Sonic Tonic. Tonight inspired by the late Queen of Soul, Aretha Franklin. It's all about the soul. We're calling it the Soul Side of Town. Plus there's more after 7.
Well, one of the reasons for why we're seeing the Saudi authorities conducting such a crackdown is because they know they can get away with it. You know, whether you are an enemy or an ally, you should not be arresting women's rights activists. You should not be sentencing peaceful activists to death. And so the Saudi authorities feel incredibly empowered to continue with their ruthless crackdown against their own citizens.
That's Lately with Karen Hay, 10 p.m. weeknights on RNZ National.
Met Service weather through to midnight tomorrow. Northland and Auckland, a few showers easing tomorrow. Waikato to Taranaki, including Coromandel Bay of Plenty, Taupo and Taumaranui. Mainly fine, but the odd shower possible from afternoon. Whanganui and Taihape to Manawatu, occasional showers. Horowhenua to Wellington, isolated showers gradually clearing tomorrow. Gisborne to Wairarapa, cloudy periods, a few showers, especially about the coast, easing tomorrow. Nelson and Marlborough mainly fine but isolated showers about the ranges. Buller to Fiordland, fine at first, showers developing in Fiordland this evening and spreading north overnight. Showers clearing north of Fiordland tomorrow morning. Canterbury mainly fine inland, the odd shower about the coast, clearing tomorrow afternoon. Otago and Southland, isolated showers turning to rain for a time tonight and tomorrow morning, then becoming fine. And for the Chatham Islands, periods of rain easing to showers overnight. It's 8 minutes past 5 and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Thank you very much indeed, Katrina Batten. Kaboom! What an extraordinary day in politics here and in Australia. Thanks everyone for being with us. We're in Australia next. They have a new Prime Minister. We do feel he's safe for the next 10 minutes or so. So we begin in New Zealand with the news just announced by the Prime Minister that Clare Curran is being removed from Cabinet and has resigned from her government digital services portfolio and open government responsibilities following another failure to properly declare a meeting. Now, this was announced by the PM at a media conference in her Mount Albert electorate office about an hour ago, and following it, just after 4:30, I spoke to Jacinda Ardern by phone.
Yeah, I've announced today, John, that I will be removing her from Cabinet. She's also relinquishing her role as Minister for Government Digital Services and Open Government. And the reason I've done that, I was advised late on Monday that the Minister had discovered that she had another situation back in February where she had met with an individual that was not appropriately recorded in her diary, and as a consequence did not answer a written question in Parliament accurately. Now, the person that she met with was a gentleman by the name of Derek Handley. He subsequently has applied for a role as the Chief Technology Officer. That's still a process that's been finalised. Look, even though there was no malice in that meeting, certainly it does not create a perception that I'm happy with, nor does it demonstrate the standard of transparency I expect from my ministers. It is the second time this has happened with the Minister, and that's why I have removed her from Cabinet.
Now she is still Broadcasting Minister, and I want to come back to that. She was Government Digital Services Minister. Should she have been meeting with Derek Handley at all in the context of the fact he was applying for this job?
Yeah, well, look, at that point, the job hadn't been advertised. That didn't happen until May, and this meeting occurred in February. And I think, if you reflect on any time, someone's applied for a job, it's not unusual to ask questions to find out more about a role. What we need to do, though, is make sure that we're entirely transparent if that happens. That's the issue here. The Minister failed to record it. She admits entirely that this was an oversight, a mistake on her part. But there needs to be consequences. This is significant. The Minister has lost 2 portfolios she cares deeply about. She's been demoted from Cabinet, but I need to make sure I'm proportionate as well.
Absolutely. I want to come back to the consequences. I just want to get to this meeting. So Derek Handley was it known then that this job was becoming available? I mean, wasn't he meeting with the Minister for whom he was hoping to work?
And the Minister, of course, also was familiar with some of the other candidates as well. Just to give you some background.
Did she meet with them? Did she meet with the other candidates?
She'd known them. She'd met some of them before. Whether or not it was specifically over this, I could not tell you. I have given the appointment process for the Chief Technology Officer to the Minister of State Services to double-check the DIA's process and ensure it is robust. I absolutely accept the perception that has been created here, which is why we're now going through a process to ensure it has been rigorous. I do not want to jeopardise the role of Chief Technology Officer. It's a significant one.
Absolutely. Is Derek Handley going to get the job? Has he been appointed but not announced?
He has been a candidate. I'm now going through a process of checking that the appointment process was robust. Certainly from what I've seen, it's been very rigorous. It was first advertised in December. It was not successfully filled. The search was widened. We announced it would be widened in February. That then kicked off, the second round kicked off some months later. It has been very rigorous, but I'm making sure officials do a final check on that before we announce who is being successful sometime likely next week, John.
Okay, so an appointment has been made, just not announced, or I'm unclear about that?
I'd prefer if I could leave the final stages of this process to be dealt with by state services, but we'll make sure that we announce the timing of events, the sequence of events at that time. What we have released today, we have released the communication that the Minister had with Mr Handley. So it'll be available for the public to see exactly what exchanges happened there so that we can ensure we have been transparent.
Absolutely, and the transparency is really important. And justice must not only be done, it must be seen to be done. Are we moving? I mean, the criticism of national governments is often that it's an old boys network. This is starting to feel a little bit like a new boys and girls network.
Not at all.
You sure?
I really refute that. Yes, of course. The space of digital technology, of course, is one where people are familiar with each other. The Minister actually hadn't met Mr Handley until that point. And he wanted to ask some questions about the role. And I think we need to keep in mind that that's not necessarily unusual. What was wrong here is the perception it has subsequently created. We should be transparent around these things. There should have been a record of it. Her office and officials should have known, and that is why the Minister is paying a hefty price for not having done that.
OK, I want to move on to a couple of things, the Australian Prime Minister, but one final question about Clare Curran. So she's outside of Cabinet, she's gone from Cabinet, and she's lost those portfolio responsibilities, but she remains Minister of Broadcasting and now outside Cabinet. Isn't that a lose-lose for the portfolio?
No. I don't think anyone would argue that we're not investing heavily in the portfolio of broadcasting. We've got quite a significant agenda there, and I expect that to continue.
OK, so the punishment, and you talked in the media conference, and I think you've used the word with me about proportionality, is that she has lost the portfolios, and she's gone from Cabinet.
And she's gone from Cabinet.
OK.
Yes.
Have you spoken to the new Australian Prime Minister?
I have. I spoke with him this afternoon, and of course he has pretty significant background knowledge and understanding of New Zealand, having been involved with New Zealand tourism in the past, and he expressed his fondness for New Zealand when we spoke, and I reiterated that I looked forward to meeting with him in the future.
Was he, I know you're not going to, this is a stupid waste of our time that I'm even asking you this question, but was there relief that it wasn't Peter Dutton? Is he an easier man for New Zealand to deal with in the context of what's taken place with the deportees and immigration?
Well, Instead, actually, I would say it's certainly beneficial to us that there's someone in the role who knows New Zealand so well, having been in the role that he has around tourism and been connected to some of the branding New Zealand has developed over the years. And so, look, there's no doubt that is helpful to us. But regardless of who was in that job, I'm going to keep advocating for New Zealanders in Australia, and equally, I'm going to keep advocating around deportation issues and issues around our offer to assist with Manus and Nauru and the refugees there. All of that stays the same regardless of who's in office.
Another thing, gosh, it's been a busy old day. Simon Bridges, the National Party, the Speaker, the leak, the inquiry. Ceasing the sense of the vulnerability of the person responsible for the leak. Is this being handled adequately, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, from the very beginning, certainly my view of the situation, for what it was worth, was that it did certainly seem to be an internal matter, and one best then managed by the Leader of the Opposition. I think that this only reinforces that. Can I
just interrupt there? Because I actually haven't heard anyone explicitly really explicitly say this. So there is absolutely no doubt whatsoever, full stop, and no light and shade, no smoke and mirrors, that the leak was from within the National Party, from within Nationals Caucus.
I don't have the same information as the Leader of the Opposition, so I certainly can't hand on heart say that. What I can hand on heart say is that it wasn't from our side.
It wasn't from the Speaker's office or anyone connected to it?
It certainly wasn't from the government side, John, because we simply don't have access to that information. And so, look, certainly from the information we have now, and of course I only know what I've read in the media, it strikes me this would best be dealt with internally and sensitively. And that's, again, just my perspective. It's not something I have control over. It ultimately is a matter for the Leader of the Opposition.
Prime Minister, can we end on a really terrible note, and that is 668 New Zealanders died by suicide in the 2017-18 year, and it is and the figure just keeps going up.
It's the highest.
It's the highest since records began, and it is almost twice the road toll. And this is a national tragedy. It is a national catastrophe, and what has to be done?
And this is the question that successive governments have asked. We have to take responsibility for our role. Our job is to make sure that there are services, that no matter where someone is or what their needs are, that there is somewhere for them to go. But equally, when I was, and that's a huge job, and there is certainly more work there to do. But when I was reading a breakdown of the statistics, we know the numbers are really high, particularly for our young men, our 20 to 24-year-olds and our 40-plus. And so that says to me, as well as the fact that we know that at least from Auckland, 60% from memory, will not have had any engagement with mental health services before. They would not have approached anyone or sought that formal help. And what that says to me is that we still have a problem as a nation with removing the stigma and for treating mental health issues the same way that we would cancer or heart disease, where we don't create an environment where people feel like they have to self-manage or that they have control over this themselves. That's the challenge for all of us. We'll do our bit. I just hope people do theirs in their community and make sure that they create environments where people can open up and seek help.
Jacinda Ardern, I spoke to her just after 4:30. Obviously a lot to cover. The suicide figures, and they are the worst in recorded history for this country. We will look at those again later in the program. Let's stick with Clare Curran for the time being. She said her meeting with Derek Hanley wasn't in her diary because it was set up directly between her and him, and she simply forgot about it when the parliamentary answer was sent out. She met Handley, we've been told, in her ministerial office at 8 p.m. one night in February after he contacted her about the Chief Technology Officer position. We've just heard the Prime Minister say that a previous process had been gone through in December and no one had been found. Derek Handley subsequently became a candidate for that position, as we've heard. Clare Curran went this afternoon, as we've also heard. Now, Clare Curran spoke to our producer, Bridget Burke, at the same time I was talking to the Prime Minister.
I've made a mistake, and it's the second time I've made the mistake. I didn't record a meeting that I had as Minister in my ministerial office in February, and as a result, when a written question was asked by the opposition about who I'd met with during a period of time, that meeting was not recorded. So therefore, that is quite serious, because it means that your accountability, you're not being accountable. What makes this even more serious is that that person is subsequently become a candidate for a significant potential appointment to government. So this is about accountability. That is about taking it on the chin, and it's about acknowledging the error and consequences.
Just to clarify, Ms. Curran, are you referring to Derek Handley as the candidate?
Yes.
Is he going to be appointed in a position, or is he just still one of the candidates in a selection process?
Yeah, so that process is ongoing. I'm no longer the minister responsible for it, so I can't comment on that.
Can you be trusted?
I think that yes is the answer to that, in that I'm prepared to be accountable and to take things on the chin and to own up when mistakes are made. And I think that it's human to make mistakes. What's important is that you own up to them when they happen.
How disappointed are you about this?
Oh, look, really disappointed. I'm very sorry that this has happened, but I do believe in being accountable, and I think that's what is most important here.
When you tendered your resignation to the Prime Minister, what were her words to you?
She is obviously not happy with what has happened. She's disappointed. She's also, I think, human as well, and is concerned. But ultimately, the government has to be accountable, and she has to demonstrate that we are. You're
going to retain the portfolio for broadcasting outside Cabinet, is that correct?
That's correct.
Why shouldn't you resign from Parliament?
I think that as the Prime Minister has said today, that it's proportionate. It is a significant demotion. I think I am taking it on the chin, and I have acknowledged error.
Clare Curran talking to our producer Bridget Burke. It's 22 minutes past 5. Well, let's go to Australia now, which has a new Prime Minister again, their 7th in just over a decade. His name is Scott Morrison, which is not the name Peter Dutton was picking it would be as he launched his attack on Malcolm Turnbull. Turnbull went, Dutton stood, Morrison took it. Scott Morrison is 50. He's been Treasurer under Turnbull, having entered Parliament in 2007. He's conservative and evangelical Christian who voted against same-sex marriage. But such is Peter Dutton's position on the right of the Liberal Party that Morrison is seen as a less hardline Conservative candidate. He'd also supported Malcolm Turnbull until it became apparent Turnbull was going to go. In short, a divided and flailing Liberal Party. Well, Scott Morrison offers the possibility of unity, and that was never going to be Peter Dutton's strength. Here's our foreign editor, Graham Acton.
After a morning where a political stalemate gripped the Parliament in Canberra, challenger Peter Dutton finally agreed to conditions laid down by Malcolm Turnbull that he wanted to see the names on paper of those seeking to topple him. Less than an hour before the proposed meeting time, the list was handed over, with party whips quickly checking the names. The first round of voting quickly eliminated Foreign Minister and Deputy Leader Julie Bishop, leaving Peter Dutton to face Treasurer Scott Morrison. In a second round of voting, Mr Morrison emerged victorious, 45 votes to 40. The result was shortly after confirmed by Liberal Whip Nola Marino.
Good afternoon. As you're all aware, there was a ballot conducted in the party room for the leadership of the Liberal Party. The successful candidate was Scott Morrison, and he won this vote by 45 votes to 40 for Peter Dutton. In relation to the deputy's position, this was won in a overwhelming sense, in a majority, an absolute majority, by Josh Frydenberg.
Nola, were there speeches? What was said ahead of the vote?
We followed the due precedent of the Liberal Party, and that's how the ballots and the process was conducted.
Chief challenger Peter Dutton was one of the very few Liberal MPs willing to speak to reporters as MPs emerged from the party room.
Earlier this morning I called the Prime Minister to advise him that it was my judgment that the majority of the party room
no longer supported his leadership. As such, I asked him to convene a meeting of the Liberal Party at which I would challenge for the leadership.
The demise of Malcolm Turnbull as leader brings to an end many years of political warfare between him and the Conservative wing of his party, and in particular former leader Tony Abbott, who emerged from the meeting focused on the future.
We've lost the Prime Minister, but there is still a government to save, and that's what all of us will do our best to do now, to save the government, because as we have just been reminding ourselves, we are the custodians of great political traditions. The Liberal tradition of smaller government, greater freedom, lower taxes.
Liberal MP Melissa Price says the support base for Peter Dutton was lacking, even as the initial vote was made to select a new leader.
You know, whether there were people at the last minute who decided to support Peter Dutton, perhaps they were in the guest cap. What I mean is, supporting this bill motion. But I think that sort of set the scene. People were very surprised, and the look on Malcolm Turnbull's face was, just horrifying. I think he was very shocked. He just couldn't believe how close it was that we had gone through all of this during the week and we really hadn't progressed that much.
For Mr Turnbull, today marks the end of a political career full of tumult and inter-party factional fighting. He steps down, still shocked at the events of the last week.
There was a determined insurgency from a number of people, both in the party room and sort of backed by voices, powerful voices in the media, really to bring, if not bring down the government, certainly bring down my Prime Ministership. It was extraordinary. It was described as madness by many, and I think it's difficult to describe it in any other way. In the party room meeting today, I was impressed by how many of my colleagues spoke or voted for loyalty above disloyalty. How the insurgents were not rewarded by electing Mr Dutton.
Malcolm Turnbull says Australian voters have quite rightly had enough of political infighting.
Australians will be just dumbstruck and so appalled by the conduct of the last week. To imagine that a government would be rocked by this sort of disloyalty and deliberate insurgency is the best way to describe it. Deliberate destructive action at a time when, there are differences on policy, but frankly all of them were sort of able to be resolved with a little bit of goodwill. I think many Australians will just be shaking their head in disbelief as what's been done.
Turnbull's decision to delay the vote and demand the names brought the time needed for the MPs opposed to Dutton to rally behind Morrison, himself a major Turnbull supporter. And Australia now has a new Prime Minister that only last week was advocating for no change at all in the leadership. Peter Dutton got his numbers horribly wrong and in the process destroyed a Prime Minister. The recriminations have already begun in Canberra, and for the Liberal Party, this is not over. Ko Graham Acton, Tene.
And we'll have more on that later in the program. The inquiry into who leaked National Leader Simon Bridges' expenses has been canned after the person responsible confessed in an anonymous text. RNZ revealed this morning a person claiming to be a National MP had sent a text message to Simon Bridges and to Speaker Trevor Mallard pleading for the investigation to be called off for the sake of their mental health. Mr Bridges wants it to forge ahead, but Trevor Mallard, the Speaker, has pulled the pin and the police are now involved. Here's our political reporter, Craig McCulloch.
Simon Bridges wouldn't talk to RNZ last night. This morning, an emergency press conference.
This morning you've seen on Radio New Zealand a story about the leak of my expenses and also a text message.
A text message with far-reaching consequences. Mr Bridges confirming he'd received a text from an unknown number on Thursday last week. Within it, a confession and a plea. The author claimed to be a National MP responsible for leaking Mr Bridges' expenses. They mentioned details from caucus meetings to prove their claim, and they asked that the inquiry be called off.
It was, I suppose, ultimately an incredibly dark, concerning text message.
The texter warned they had a prolonged, serious mental illness and worried being exposed could put their life at risk. Mr Bridges went to the police. The police tracked the leaker down. They won't say who it is, but they do say the person has the help they need, that there were well-being issues, but they're not in immediate danger.
And at no time did police tell me that the investigation should not proceed.
But it isn't proceeding. The Speaker, Trevor Mallard, issuing a sudden statement this afternoon. The inquiry is off. He says the leaker is clearly disturbed and his priority is getting them appropriate support. The text confirms the leak is most likely from within the National Party, he says, and as such is a party matter. The Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern in line with the Speaker.
If indeed this is an issue that's come out of the caucus, and if there are indeed mental health issues, it would strike me that needs to be dealt with really sensitively, and perhaps if that is the case, best dealt with internally rather than externally.
Simon Bridges, though, isn't happy. He wants to forge ahead with the inquiry. He says the integrity of Parliament is at stake.
I'm not a cold-hearted person. I have real concern for this person's well-being. I've shown that in my actions. But ultimately, we don't know what we're dealing with here, whether it is, frankly, a more cynical manipulation of the system.
And he's pushing back against the claims the leak definitely came from within.
It could well have been someone who wasn't a Member of Parliament or even in the National Party system, if you like. I simply cannot safely say.
So what happens next? Nationals promised not to let it go. It says it needs to know who's behind the leak and will endeavour to find out. The senior MP, Jerry Brownlee, furious with the Speaker.
That's Mr Mallard turning his finger on the opposition, the 56 MPs, almost half the Parliament who make up the National Party, and saying, you are guilty. It is appalling behaviour from him.
National could yet launch a party inquiry, the Speaker says. If so, Parliamentary Service would cooperate. But there are bigger questions for Mr Bridges' leadership. 2 damaging leaks, the first to News Hub, the second to RNZ, both which could have come from within his caucus. That's only going to fuel paranoia, and a leader who can't trust his own colleagues will find it difficult to lead at all. Atu iti whare parimata mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi, ko Craig McCulloch hu.
Thanks for being with us on Checkpoint. Coming up, more on the suicide rate, the highest since record began. How many power poles in Dunedin are in urgent need of replacement? And where is Aurora? Aurora, we'd love to talk to you. And why is there a crane in a concrete block now holding a Green Island power pole in place? Plus, farming in a fishbowl, what happens when open access to farmland goes bad? Known as next with business. We'd love your feedback, 2101. You know all the details, but with the time at 28 minutes to 6, here's Katrina with the headlines.
The Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has sacked Clare Curran from her cabinet over an undiaried meeting Ms Curran had in February. She's lost the government digital services portfolio and open government responsibilities. Ms Ardern says it's a significant demotion, but it's proportionate to the incident, and Ms Curran's actions are not something she'll tolerate from a Minister for Open Government. Clare Curran says she believes she's taking it on the chin and doesn't see the need to resign from Parliament. Former Australian Treasurer Scott Morrison is the new Prime Minister across the Tasman after a 3-way challenge to Malcolm Turnbull's leadership. Mr Morrison saw off former Immigration Minister Peter Dutton by 5 votes in a Liberal Party caucus ballot. He also defeated Foreign Minister and Deputy Leader Julie Bishop. The Deputy Prime Minister Winston Peters says Opposition Leader Winston Peters has dealt with the leak around his expenses in a cack-handed manner. The Speaker Trevor Mallard has pulled the plug on an inquiry he initially ordered into who leaked Mr Bridges' expenses, saying it's now a matter for National to deal with, as it's likely the person responsible is from the party. Mr Bridges wants to push on with the inquiry, but Mr Peters says it would be a gross waste of taxpayers' money to continue. Firefighters are being forced to slow down on emergency call-outs or risk being prosecuted. The Firefighters Union says some engines are being fitted with low-grade tyres that can't be driven above 100 kilometres an hour. John Waldo says it's a result of the fire service trying to save money. Winter Games Chief Executive Marty Toomey says changing this year's competition to an annual event will prove a boon for New Zealand snow sports. Traditionally, the competition is held every 2 years. Mr Toomey says the change will attract more athletes to New Zealand and encourage the next generation to consider competing. Those are the headlines. I'm back at 6 o'clock.
Which is 26 minutes away. Thanks so much, Katrina. Let's turn to business news now with Nona.
I'm here.
Oh, hi, Nona. Pay television operator Sky Television Network, Sky TV, has reported a hefty annual loss. after slashing the value of its business. Gosh, they're having a tough old run, aren't they?
Yeah, but this was a paper write-off, so it's not really cash. They haven't lost actually any cash. They've just sort of written down the value of some of their business to the tune of, I think, $360 million. It's quite a lot, but this is a company that's been in decline for a while. Subscriber numbers are down, revenue's down, profit is down. But you know what? The net profit really actually wasn't so bad when you've stripped out all these one-time things. The company's performance is what you'd expect. And even though the revenue numbers were lower than expectation, the market reaction wasn't too harsh. But look, John Follett, who's Sky's chief executive, he's been sort of saying for a while, look, there's a lot of doomsayers out there. And he had a media conference this morning to get ahead of this, I guess, bad news. And we have a little bit of what he had to say. He was with his chief financial officer, Jason Hollingworth.
I think the issue on, the net income and the cash flow and I think the impact of of individual content deals gets way overrated.
And with that obviously large drop in NPAT, obviously not the underlying, but in the NPAT from that impairment of goodwill, Are you concerned about the reputational damage of that?
And that's why we invited you in to help clear that.
Because we didn't want to read about, we've just lost 240 million. No, we haven't. It's not even cash, it's nothing. It's an adjustment on a balance sheet. It's literally a journal entry. But it is a funny number when you look at it. Does that mean it's the end of Sky? It's nothing like that. Actual numbers, the real numbers, the cash flow is up.
So that John Follett sounded like Jason Hollingworth as well.
Yeah, that's right. The chief financial officer was also there.
Both there.
And it was Madison Reedy, our business reporter, chatting to them this morning. So, look, it's a company in flux. I mean, John Follett's going to be retiring. Who knows who's going to be taking over? But certainly the company's been in steady hands for a long time. If they can't weather this storm, I mean, it's the way it is with the media businesses generally. We saw that with NZME earlier in the week. And, it's generally across the board.
Kiwi Bank, good profit, Nona.
Yeah, actually, Kiwi Bank, yes. Well, they did make a good profit, but that's because the year before they took quite a hit on their technology. Now, that's an issue that still hasn't quite gone away. There's some things going on behind the boardroom door with a couple of the new shareholders, that's ACC and Superfund, challenging NZ Post, still the main stakeholder in Kiwi Bank, about the costs that they took on when they bought into the bank. So they're concerned about the tech stocks, the technology investments there and how that worked out. We don't know what's happening there, and I don't know that we're going to find out. No. Meanwhile, the company made a profit of $122 million. That's quite a good profit. Of course, it was against that big write-down the year earlier. The underlying profit was up 3%, so not as much as double what they made the year before. Now, look, that profit, some of it was portioned back to NZ Post, which helped them a little bit because as a big shareholder, they were able to offset some of their considerable losses. New Zealand Post.
The mail business, the dear old New Zealand Post mail business.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow.
And their costs have gone up with their growth in parcel business. So without the parcel business, they would have been in pretty bad shape. Overall, though, they made a net profit of $13 million, and that reflected their gain from Kiwi Bank. So
markets.
The markets, we rose 0.2% by 20 points to close at 9,160, and our dollar is trading at 66.4 US cents, 91.2 Australian, and 51.8 pence, and that's been helped by some settling over in Australia with their new Prime Minister coming on board.
Right. So not a strong reaction in Australia to that.
Well, there had been, but now it's been settled.
Nona Peltier, thank you very much indeed. Have a great weekend, Nona. Let's return to the terrible figures out today. Suicide stats, they're at an all-time high for the fourth year in a row. 668 people died by suicide in the year to June, 62 more than the year before. It's almost double the road toll. Young people were once again making up a high number of those who died. Reporter Charlie Drever spoke to those at the coalface of a mental health crisis.
It absolutely breaks my heart to think that in the 5.5 years since my son died, Ross, nothing has changed.
Corinda Taylor's son Ross was just 20 years old when he took his own life. It's the age group which is most likely to die from suicide, but Corinda Taylor says her son ran out of options.
My son knew to ask for help, and yet he was also turned away from services, 3 times before he died. I don't want to see that for our young people.
Since July 2007 until June this year, 6,204 sons, daughters, siblings, fathers, mothers and friends were lost to suicide, and that number is growing every year. Mental Health Foundation Chief Executive Sean Robinson says more needs to be done to address the root causes.
Our high rates of family violence, our high rates of child abuse, our high rates of bullying, all have a very, significant impact on these trends that we're seeing.
Sean Robinson says not enough support is being given to target the most at-risk groups. Māori were once again overrepresented with 142 deaths in the past year, the highest since records began a decade ago. Of those, 97 were male. Kiritahi Furman from Suicide Intervention Group Kimi Ora Trust says the support isn't there despite the demand.
I really want to challenge the funders currently, challenge them in a way to look at those of our organisations like Kimi Ora Trust that sit in schools that are not funded. We go and do this for free.
Kiritahi Furman says it's not just funding that's needed, but recognition of their work. Suicide is the #1 killer of young people, with 20 to 24-year-olds being the most at-risk age group, with 76 deaths. Green Party MP Chloe Swarbrick says the culture around opening up with our own struggles needs to change.
I, from my understanding, am the only sitting MP at the moment who has spoken openly about their own history with regard to mental health issues. And I think that it's critical that we do have, representatives and those people who are fortunate enough to have platforms in our society speaking openly about their experiences, because it gives license to other people to do so. But more than that, it normalises the conversation and it reduces that stigma.
Chloe Swarbrick says mental health needs to be treated as a crisis, which is why the Green Party is still pushing for free counselling for under 25s. Everyone RNZ spoke to was eagerly awaiting the findings of the government's mental health and addiction inquiry. Meanwhile, Corinda Taylor now runs the Life Matters Suicide Prevention Trust. She's urging people to look out for the signs.
I encourage all families and friends and colleagues at work to get yourself trained up in suicide prevention so that you can know what those signs are and how to support that person. And also the person that doesn't typically show depressive symptoms, just remember, be kind, be nice. You could just save somebody's life if you are just nice on that particular day.
For those suffering, they're being encouraged to use the mental health services available, because you do matter and you're worth so much more than a sobering statistic. For Checkpoint, Charlie Drever.
It's coming up to 17 minutes to 6. Let's go to power poll 84194 in the Dunedin suburb of Green Island. Now, we covered the story earlier in the week. A rotten power pole on a precarious lane loaded with high voltage assets and close to a school, a busy main street and a local pub. Aurora, the lines company owned by the Dunedin City Council, told us it was red tagged, essentially flagged for replacement in June. Right, but as our Otago Southern reporter Timothy Brown has found out, that's not the full story.
On Wednesday, when this story first aired on Checkpoint, poll 84194 was slated for replacement, but no immediate strengthening work was required. However, within 24 hours, a concrete block was placed at its base and a $250,000 crane truck was attached to the top. In a statement, Aurora admits this is no coincidence.
The particular pole at Green Island is scheduled for replacement next week, but yesterday, due to the media attention, we have taken visible and immediate action to stabilise the pole.
Yet today, the truck is gone and another concrete block across the stream is in its place. And according to Richard Healy, a former employee turned whistleblower that sparked an audit of the company's network, the concrete block is nothing more than a PR exercise.
It looks really good when you've got a big heavy concrete block strapped to the bottom of the pole. So this isn't about reducing risk, this is about addressing public perception.
Mr. Healy says it's galling that it was first identified as a risk in June, and yet strengthening has only taken place after media attention. Only, it wasn't first identified as a risk in June. Not this year anyway. The pole was inspected in 2015, 3 years ago, and was in a condition that required replacement back then. So why wasn't it? And why was it left off the company's fast-track pole program, which cost $30 million and ended in December last year? Mr Healy says he has the answers.
Aurora's poll testing program is just shambolic. So nothing about this surprises me.
So you're saying that the fix for many of these red tag polls has in fact just been a claw hammer to remove the tag?
Yeah, absolutely. Not only has it been a claw hammer to remove the tag, but what you find is maybe 6 months later a new system is adopted to assess the polls and the red tag's been put back on.
When RNZ toured the city looking at previously red tag polls, we found some replaced, others now with blue tags and others still with no tags and no replacement. Which begs the question, how many red tags are there in the network? And how can a poll go from needing replaced within a year, max, one day, to perfectly fine the next? Well, we couldn't get Aurora to front for us, despite dozens of calls, emails and messages to their staff and others at the Dunedin City Council and Dunedin City Holdings. Dunedin's Mayor Dave Cull texted to say he agrees with Aurora's approach. And despite asking for days, we still don't know how many red tag polls there are in the network. In fact, neither does Aurora. Cold comfort for parents and caregivers of children at St Peter Chanel School.
I think it's actually quite dangerous for all the children that come in, anybody that comes in, for any reason actually, not just the children, anybody.
And what would your reaction be if I told you that they actually first identified it as a risk back in 2015?
I think that's disgusting.
Yeah, that's terrible. You'd think that would be a priority, wouldn't you?
It's an issue to any pedestrian, isn't it? Because there's major weight on it. It's on a popular footpath and it could probably go.
And what if I told you, in fact, it was actually red tagged and identified as a risk first back in 2015, but they later took the tag off?
It doesn't surprise me. The infrastructure around power in Otago and Dunedin is terrible.
Aurora has given its assurance the poll will be replaced next week. But there's no date set for when we'll get answers. In Dunedin, for Checkpoint, Timothy Brown.
And Aurora, we'd like to leave Checkpoint available to you to appear at any stage and talk about the state of your power polls and why polls get red flagged and then unred flagged and what's going on. The floor is yours. 2 siblings have been jailed for 20 years, all up for supplying methamphetamine linked to a boat that washed up on 90 Mile Beach. More than 500 kilos of meth was found on the Northland beach in June 2016. That's right, it was 500 kilos. A police investigation uncovered a national drug supply chain, and the brother and sister were jailed for 13 and 7 years respectively for their part in it. Our reporter Annika Smith was at the High Court in Auckland.
Ricky and Siobhan Wellington were sentenced for their roles in a methamphetamine supply chain that stretched the length of the country. A jury found the pair guilty of possessing methamphetamine for supply and supplying the Class A drug last month. This morning, Justice Palmer began his sentencing by denouncing methamphetamine.
Methamphetamine destroys lives and communities. Those dealing in methamphetamine cause and profit from human misery. It is why in 2003, methamphetamine was reclassified as a Class A drug in New Zealand.
The Wellingtons transported about 1.5 kilograms of methamphetamine each in a number of trips between Auckland and Christchurch in October 2016. They used coded drug talk and frequently changed phone numbers and vehicles to avoid detection. A woman connected to the boat that washed up on 90 Mile Beach led police to the siblings, who were put under surveillance as part of Operation Virunga. Today, Siobhan Wellington's defence lawyer Annabelle Maxwell-Scott said her client had used her time in custody to address her drug addiction, which drove her offending. The 26-year-old started a university degree before she was charged and still had a bright future ahead of her.
Yes, she is an intelligent young woman, and she is, I suppose, an awful example of what happens when drugs become involved in someone's life, and her family is very aware of that. She was doing well, and I think still has the ability to do well. She's an intelligent young woman and a very determined young woman.
Annabelle Maxwell-Scott said Ms Wellington had already spent 2 years in custody, and there was plenty of evidence to show that giving her a lengthy sentence wouldn't deter others.
One only has to look at the increase in methamphetamine on the streets, methamphetamine offending, since the sentence was increased to a life sentence, to see that it simply doesn't work. Deterrence is based on the concept that those offending know they will be caught and what the sentences are likely to be, and that is just simply not the case.
Ricky Wellington's lawyer Mark Ryan said his client had potential to reform with the help of his family, who supported the pair from the public gallery during sentencing. Justice Palmer imposed a minimum non-parole period of 5 years for Mr Wellington. No minimum period was imposed for Ms Wellington. Mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi nei, ko Annika Smith aho.
After the stoush over demands for greater access to a farm owned by American TV personality Matt Lauer, farmers say the surge in visitors wanting to roam across their land is making them feel like they're farming in a fishbowl. The Walking Access Commission says a number of tracks in the South Island's high country are becoming overrun by tourists, thanks in part to social media. And some farmers say in this day and age where everything is put online, those who allow access also have to face a new level of public scrutiny, often from city people who just don't understand farming. Maya Burry reports.
High Country Farm manager Jim Greenslade is shifting pregnant ewes on the Lakes Station in North Canterbury. This 5,000-hectare sheep and beef farm has 5 lakes on the property and backs onto the Lake Sumner Forest Park, a popular recreational area for fishing, boating and tramping that draws in thousands of visitors each year. Mr Greenslade says at the back of the farm there is an easement, allowing part of the Lake Sumner Forest Park walkway to go through the property, and he often allows people to fish on the farm if they ask for permission. He says they need to control access through the farm for safety reasons.
The area is fragile and it's dangerous at times, and it's wet and you get stuck, and the river is a major obstacle.
2 years ago, a photo of cattle from the station wading in a lake was released to the media. Mr Greenslade didn't want to discuss that incident, but he says the farm is very focused on looking after the environment. He says it has gone through a considerable expense to fence off stock from the lakes, which was a legal requirement, but something they were very happy to do. I asked Mr Greenslade whether he thought allowing public access through a farm did open up a farmer to scrutiny.
We do think twice about people coming up the river and seeing cattle, some cattle in the river, and obviously you know there's a photo in the paper the next day, and instead of ringing me and say, look, do you know you've got 2 cattle in the river? I mean, we don't have to have the cattle out of the river, and at the moment we don't have to fence our rivers off up here because we're an extensive farming operation. But there is that, if you want to combine this conversation with access, I guess you could say that is an element that we think about.
Several hundred kilometres away in the tussock country of the Mackenzie district, as many as 100,000 people cross the Mount John walkway on Andrew Simpson's High Country Farm Balmoral station each year. Mr Simpson says it is a concern that a visitor will misunderstand the sometimes harsh realities of farming.
You're basically farming in a fishbowl. As soon as you let the public on your farm, these things will turn around and bite you in the bum at some stage. It's not that we want those sort of things to happen on your farm, but when you've got livestock, you've sometimes got dead stock. So we hope not too many dead stock around our walkways, and we're pretty adamant that if there are dead sheep there, that they'd have to be removed and picked up. But yeah, you do run that risk.
The Walking Access Commission's acting chief executive, Rick Cullinane, is aware of these sorts of worries being raised by farmers, but he believes opening up the farm gate to the public will help ease the urban-rural divide.
People who live in cities begin to understand what it means for farmers, the challenges and issues that they face. It's a great opportunity to share understanding. I think that overall that can only be a benefit to the country and create a bit more social cohesion and provide that social licence for farming.
Federated Farmers High Country spokesperson Simon Williamson says the public need to recognise that access through private farmland is at the landholder's discretion, and it was not a right that should be assumed. He says when a farmer did deny access, it's generally for safety reasons or because a farming operation is taking place, such as lambing.
Just in the last probably 10 to 15 years, there seems to be a groundswell of people saying that they don't need to have access, they should have the right to walk everywhere. And I think it's uninformed. I don't know what backing that they think they have to do that.
Mr Williamson says there are plenty of walks through conservation land people could do if they don't want to phone a farmer for permission. For Checkpoint, Maya Burry.
And you can hear more from Maya about farms and public access on Inside, which is just after the 8 o'clock news on Sunday morning on Wallace's show. Lots of feedback coming in tonight, and we've got a few samples here. Delta and Aurora maintenance problems are directly related to the asset stripping by the owner, DCC, to build the stadium. Good stadium, too high a cost, says John from Dunedin. Thanks, John. What a great bit of dogged local reporting there by Timothy Brown. Bravo. Yes, we couldn't agree more. Clare Curran, doesn't she have a secretary? Wasn't the meeting held in her office? Where was the secretary? Who keeps the diary? Suicide rates. A heartfelt thank you to Charlie Drever. Charlie was our reporter who did that story, for switching into the second person at the end of her report on suicide statistics, saying, you do matter and you are worth more than a statistic. It brought tears to my eyes, and I'm in a good space right now. I equally hope it reached and gave hope to people who really needed to hear it too. Thank you. And thank you, Charlie. I noticed that and I thought it was a lovely touch. Right, with Trans-Tasman Rugby Trophy, with one Trans-Tasman Rugby Trophy already wrapped up by the Black Ferns, the All Blacks can claim another win. Both teams host their Australian counterparts in Auckland tomorrow night. The double-header at Eden Park, the women's match kicks off at 5, the men's at 7:30, comes after an identical event in Sydney last weekend. Now, the Black Ferns, the women's team, retained the Laurie O'Reilly Memorial Trophy with a comfortable 31-11 win, while the All Blacks, the men's team, were 25-point victors over the Wallabies to go 1-0 up, but theirs is a 3-match series for the Bledisloe Cup. A win tomorrow night would not only secure the All Blacks the Cup for a 16th straight year, it would also extend their winning streak at Eden Park to 42 matches. But Captain Kieran Reid says those things haven't been their focus this week.
This streak here is not really important in terms of the streak. It's important for the game that this is. You know, this is Bledisloe 2. There's a chance for us to get both hands on the cup. So that's where we're coming from. And we love playing here. This is our home in New Zealand, and our home fans, we just enjoy it. So hopefully we can come out here and put on a good performance.
All Blacks captain Kieran Reid there. Joining us now to discuss the game is our excellent sports reporter Clay Wilson. How are you, Clay?
Good evening, John.
What are we talking about? The Black Ferns. What can we expect from them? The Black Ferns are really exciting because it's wonderful to see the rise and rise of women's rugby. Plus, there's a whole lot of new players in this team who've just come from, kaboom. They're coming in and they just look like they belong after one game.
Yeah, there's a lot more names that we're going to start to know a lot more about, I would say. I think in short we can probably expect a better performance with a bit more polish. There was their first game since the World Cup final last weekend, which is about a 10-month period, so you could expect they were a little bit rusty. They lacked fluidity. Australia, you could argue, are getting a little bit closer. They are making strides with their program. They had a women's Super Rugby competition this year, but I would expect the Black Ferns to be much better and probably be too good again.
Yeah, and also they were playing in Sydney last week, right, and they're playing in Auckland this week, so it's a hell of a difference. And this is a fairly Auckland-strong women's team, isn't it?
Definitely is,
yeah. Okay. Plenty of discussion around the crowd for the women's game. So the women's game is at 5 and the men's game is at 7:30.
Correct, yeah.
And what we noticed last week in Sydney is the seats were filling up the closer it got to the men's game. And obviously everyone is really anxious, keen, desirous of avoiding that.
Yeah, there was a lot of talk and disappointment about how few people showed up for the kickoff last week in Sydney. So I guess there's been a lot of talk this week about making sure that with the momentum the Black Ferns have, the momentum women's rugby have, that people show up on time and show their support for the women's team and show that they do really value this team and what they've done, because they've been hugely successful, of course. So
world champs, sevens champs, yeah.
So we will see. I guess it's great for the women to have a double header alongside the men, but what that does bring is if people want to come along, it's 4.5 or 5 hours sitting in a stadium seat, paying for overpriced food and drinks.
Not very good overpriced food and drinks. I mean, I think the onus is on the organisers to try harder on that front. I mean, if they're going to double head and we want both teams to be treated with respect, they have to look after the crowd better if the crowd's going to be there for 4 or 5 hours.
Well, it's a complaint that's been around for a while, I guess. So I guess still a great opportunity for the women's team. So let's see. People will vote with their feet tomorrow.
The men's match, the dear old Wallabies. I mean, they were playing at home. Boy, they had a good 30 minutes. I thought, wow, this is exciting. And then off went the All Blacks in the second half. At Eden Park, are they really up against it, Clay?
Well, they certainly are. I mean, there's been a lot of numbers thrown around this week, but I just want to highlight a few of the most important ones just to really show what they're up against this week.
So
the Wallabies haven't won. The Wallabies haven't won at Eden Park since 1986. I was born in 1986, so it's 32 years. It's 17 straight losses, and there was only 4 players involved last weekend that were born before 1986, before that game. They also haven't won in New Zealand since 2001. It's 22-match losing streak. And, of course, the All Blacks at Eden Park, formidable. They haven't lost there in 24 years, a 41-match winning streak. So, I mean, Australia are always capable of beating the All Blacks. They did it last year in Brisbane. But you really feel, given everything that we've just spoken about, that they're going to have to play very well and the All Blacks are going to have something of an off night.
I don't know whether we're meant to talk about this. There's lots of other things to talk about, but Michael Cheika, the pressure's got to go on him at some stage. He can't just sit in the box the coach's box moaning about the referee ad infinitum. At some stage, he's got to get that team beating the All Blacks, doesn't he?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess he can do everything else, but if he doesn't beat the All Blacks, then people are still going to be complaining. So it's a pretty tough task, you have to say. I mean, arguably they've made small strides, but I guess when it comes to the All Blacks, the world's best team, it's a pretty big challenge.
I hope it's close tomorrow night. I really hope the Wallabies turn up. I mean,
yeah.
it'd be really...
I think a lot of us do, just for the rivalry in general, yeah.
Yeah. On the milestone front, Sam Whitelock played his 100th test last weekend. You had a beautiful story about number 100 this weekend. That was on Checkpoint last night. Tell us about him.
Yeah, Owen Franks, of course, veteran prop. He's played... He's going to play his 100th test tomorrow night. He's the 9th man to get there. There was some great stuff. He's a really gruff character, man, a few words, but some lovely stuff about emotional texts from his brother and things of this nature. So I guess the sentiment that shone through, he's just an ultimate professional, a guy who looks after his body very, very seriously, and when it comes to game day, he never lets you down. So a great milestone for him.
Are the Warriors going to win tonight, Clay?
Yeah, if they win, they'll seal their first playoff spot for 7 years. So fingers crossed for Warriors fans.
Clay Wilson, thank you very much indeed. It's 6 o'clock.
RNZ News at 6. Kia ora, good afternoon. Ko Katrina Batanaho. The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, says Clare Curran's failure to properly declare a meeting for a second time does not meet the standard of transparency she expects from her ministers. Ms Curran lost her government digital services portfolio and her open government responsibilities after she failed to record in her diary a meeting she had in February with tech entrepreneur Derek Handley. Ms Curran's staff and officials weren't made aware of the meeting, and it was subsequently left out of an answer to a recent written parliamentary question. Ms Ardern told Checkpoint Mr Handley was interested in the government's vacant role of Chief Technology Officer. She says he wanted to question Ms Curran about the role, and that isn't unusual.
What was wrong here is the perception it has subsequently created. We should be transparent around these things. There should have been a record of it. Her office and officials should have known, and that is why the Minister is paying a hefty price for not having done that.
Jacinda Ardern says Ms Curran will keep her broadcasting portfolio. Clare Curran says she can still be trusted. She admits that the mistake of not properly declaring a meeting for the second time is serious and says she's prepared to be held accountable.
And to take things on the chin and to own up when mistakes are made. And I think that it's human to make mistakes. What's important is that you own up to them when they happen.
Former Cabinet Minister Clare Curran. The Deputy Prime Minister Winston Peters says opposition leader Simon Bridges has dealt with the leak around his expenses in a cack-handed manner. The Speaker Trevor Mallard has pulled the plug on an inquiry he initially ordered into who leaked Mr Bridges' expenses, saying it's now a matter for National to deal with, as it's likely the person responsible is from the party. Mr Bridges wants to push on with the inquiry, but Mr Peters says it would be a gross waste of taxpayers' money to continue.
The reality of it is this is a sensitive issue, but whilst it was a matter of high sensitivity, it didn't stop Mr Bridges going out and making all sorts of statements without the facts and implicating people who were totally innocent.
Winston Peters, the Deputy Prime Minister. The National Party still plans to find out who was responsible for the leak. Outgoing Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull has taken a swipe at what he describes as insurgents inside his Liberal Party, saying they attacked his leadership and his government from within. Mr Turnbull did not contest the leadership contest earlier today that saw Treasurer Scott Morrison take the leadership from challenger Peter Dutton. In his concession speech, Malcolm Turnbull hailed his successor as loyal and effective. And he was satisfied that those seeking to undermine him were not rewarded.
There was a determined insurgency from a number of people, both in the party room, backed by voices, powerful voices in the media, really to bring, if not bring down the government, certainly bring down my prime ministership.
Dumped Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. Green Party MP Chloe Swarbrick wants attitudes to mental health issues to change. Suicide figures released by the Chief Coroner today found 668 people died by suicide over the past year, with 20 to 24-year-olds being the most at risk. Chloe Swarbrick says it's important she, as an MP, has openly spoken about her history of anxiety and depression as it normalises the problem. She says our country's mental health needs to be treated as a crisis and the under-25s need to have access to free counselling. Winter Games Chief Executive Marty Toomey says changing this year's competition to an annual event will prove a boon for New Zealand snow sports. The competition is traditionally held every 2 years. Mr Toomey says the change will attract more athletes to New Zealand and encourage the next generation to consider competing.
The ability for kids to ride a chairlift with some of their heroes or heroines, just to be able to sit and talk to them, see that they're actually human after all. But to actually be able to watch them, learn from them, talk to them about it, it's amazing. The access the kids get to these superstars is quite different to most sports.
Mr Toomey says the competition also brought a $13.4 million boost to the region last year. The Winter Games officially opens tonight and runs until September the 8th. It's 6:04. Sport, the Warriors are still chasing an unlikely top 4 finish in the National Rugby League, but a win tonight over Penrith would at least confirm their place in the playoffs. After their surprise loss to the Bulldogs last weekend, a win tonight will assure them of a playoff position with 1 round remaining. But just where they finish in the top 8 isn't concerning coach Stephen Kearney.
You know, for us, quite honestly, it's not about that. You know, I think, you know, the reality is, you know, we've got to play well. And, you know, I'm pretty confident that we give ourselves a good opportunity if we do that this weekend. And that's all that matters to us, is about performance. And, you know, where that takes us, you know, that's in our hands.
Stephen Kearney. The former St George, Illawarra and Cronulla Rugby League player Lance Thompson has died. The 40-year-old was found dead at an apartment in Sydney last night. His death is not being treated as suspicious and the police say there was no evidence of self-harm. The All Blacks are playing down any concern about Sam Cane, despite the open-side flanker sitting out today's training with a knee problem ahead of tomorrow's second Bledisloe Cup test against Australia in Auckland. Cane watched as the All Blacks went through their preparations at Eden Park this afternoon, but All Blacks skipper Kieran Reid expects Cane to take the field tomorrow night. Meanwhile, Taranaki have their first Ranfurly Shield defence of the season when they play Manawatu tonight. Go Taranaki. That's the news.
Tomorrow morning, Chelsea Manning, who as Bradley Manning, released thousands of classified documents to WikiLeaks and was sentenced to 35 years in prison. Lizzie Marvelly, self-described overachiever, her first book is called Growing Up Feminist in Aotearoa. And Scottish writer Denise Minor on her very dark novel based on a real mass murder. Join me, Kim Hill, tomorrow morning from 8 on RNZ National.
Met Service weather through to midnight tomorrow. Northland and Auckland, a few showers easing tomorrow. Waikato to Taranaki, including Coromandel, Bay of Plenty, Taupo and Taumaranui. Mainly fine, but the odd shower possible from afternoon. Whanganui and Taihepe to Manawatu, occasional showers. Horowhenua to Wellington, isolated showers clearing gradually tomorrow. Gisborne to Wairarapa, cloudy periods, a few showers, especially about the coast, easing tomorrow. Nelson and Marlborough, mainly fine, but isolated showers about the ranges. Bulla to Fiordland, fine at first. Showers developing in Fiordland this evening and spreading north overnight. Showers clearing north of Fiordland tomorrow morning. Canterbury, mainly fine inland. The odd shower about the coast, clearing tomorrow afternoon. Otago and Southland, isolated showers turning to rain for a time tonight and tomorrow morning, then becoming fine. And for the Chatham Islands, periods of rain easing to showers overnight. It is coming up to 6:08 and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Thank you very much indeed. Katrina, have a wonderful weekend.
I'll try my very hardest.
Good. You going to the rugby?
No.
No.
But I'll be cheering on Taranaki as well.
Okay, actually, that'll be a good game.
It will be a good game.
Thanks, KB. Dump Cabinet Minister Clare Curran says she has let herself and the Prime Minister down. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has stripped Ms Curran of her government digital services portfolio and her open government responsibilities after she failed to properly declare a meeting for the second time. The February meeting was with tech entrepreneur Derek Handley, who was interested in the government's Chief Technology Officer job. The announcement about that is due to be made next week. The Dunedin South MP made a similar admission in relation to a meeting with former RNZ News boss Carol Hirschfeld last year. Our political editor Jane Patterson joins us now. Jane,
John, hello.
Hello, it's nice to have you with us. I don't know about you, but I'm buggered. What was this a sacking offence? And if so, has she been sacked enough?
Look, the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, had no choice when faced with the second misdemeanour from Clare Curran for exactly the same thing. And as you alluded to in your introduction, we saw Clare Curran reprimanded by the Prime Minister over failing to disclose the meeting with Carol Hirschfeld that had significant political fallout, and now here we are again some months later with exactly the same situation. Now, Ms Ardern faced a fair amount of criticism at the time over the Carol Hirschfeld story, that Ms Curran wasn't dealt with more severely, so faced with the second one, she had no option but to remove her from Cabinet. I would note she does keep the broadcasting portfolio, and that's out of Cabinet, but outside of Cabinet.
Is that where that portfolio belongs? I mean, the RNZ obviously takes that portfolio really seriously, but is it an outside of Cabinet portfolio? It's a funny opposition now, isn't it?
It is, and under the National Government, casting back my mind, I'm pretty sure under Craig Foss it was outside Cabinet.
Well done,
then it was
Jane.
Brought back in.
Yeah.
Stretching back, brought back into Cabinet with Amy Adams when she was took on that broadcasting portfolio, and there it had sat as the Labour coalition government took over with Clare Curran being inside Cabinet. Now, there absolutely is something to be gained by having the minister inside of Cabinet. There is the influence and just the information and access to other ministers and the chance to
including
pitch.
the Finance Minister, right?
That's right, it does have an impact and on this portfolio.
Yeah. What do you make of the time of the announcement? 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, the same day that we've got a new Prime Minister in Australia. More on that in a sec. With all the Simon Bridges expenses stuff going on, was that willful timing, or is that just when she could say this stuff?
Look, this had been planned since at least yesterday, so the Simon Bridges story did not have any play in this. But I do question that, given the Prime Minister knew about this on Monday, that 4 o'clock on a Friday before the weekend was the time to announce this. So it's always the good old Friday dump and a couple of hours or an hour before the bulletins, and then things do tend to drop off over the weekend without the scrutiny of those week-time news programs. And also, as we have discussed in terms of Clare Curran's former portfolios, having the title of Open Government always makes these things just that more intense when you are found not to have disclosed information. And in fact, the Prime Minister said it has left Clare Curran open to the accusation she deliberately sought to hide the meeting, even though that was not her intention. So not a great day for the Open Government portfolio.
Jane Patterson, our political editor, thanks so much for joining us at the end of a busy old week. It's been a busy week across the ditch as well. Scott Morrison is now the leader of Australia's Liberal Party and as a result the country's 30th Prime Minister. Malcolm Turnbull clung on to the top job after a leadership challenge from Peter Dutton earlier this week. He was forced to call another party meeting this morning for a second vote after he was handed a petition showing his party wanted another go. Peter Dutton had done all the Macbeth work, really, but he didn't get it. Nor did Julie Bishop, who saw an opportunity to sneak through the middle. It went to Scott Morrison, a 50-year-old evangelical conservative Christian, quietly slipped in, winning 45 votes to 40. He'd previously supported Turnbull. Mr Morrison has yet to speak publicly about his win. We think he's going to do that shortly, but here's Malcolm Turnbull, now the former Prime Minister, speaking after the vote.
Australians will be just dumbstruck and so appalled by the conduct of the last week. To imagine that a government would be rocked by this sort of disloyalty and deliberate, insurgency is the best way to describe it, deliberate destructive action at a time when, there are differences on policy, but frankly all of them were able to be resolved with a little bit of goodwill. And of course, a month ago, as I said yesterday, we were, a little bit behind in the national polls and a little bit ahead on our own polls. So it will be, I think many Australians will just be shaking their head in disbelief as what's been done. So just go to Murpharoo there. Well, unity, Phil, is if you're not, disunity is death in Australian politics, as everyone says, and it's perfectly obvious. But the people who chose, Peter Dutton and Tony Abbott and others, who chose to deliberately attack the government from within, they did so because they wanted to bring the government down. They wanted to bring my Prime Ministership down. And
Malcolm Turnbull had previously promised to quit Parliament if he lost the leadership of his party, and when asked to put a date to his departure now that's happened, he says he will leave, quote, not before too long. He says that will be the end of his political career.
Insofar as there has been chaos this week, it has been created by the wreckers. I have done everything I can to maintain the stability of government and the stability of the party. But, of course, if people are determined to wreck, then, they will continue to do so. Yes?
This would be a reasonable question. Do you have any interest at all in...
I have no idea what he's going to ask. Just picking Jack up from school, maybe. Yes.
He starts next year.
From here on.
No. This is. Look, I came into politics at the very mature age of 50, and I've had a very good time here in the Parliament. I've always been focused on what I can deliver for the Australian people. Again, the critical thing is with politics, it's not about the politicians. That's why this week has been so dispiriting, because it just appears to be, vengeance, personal ambition, factional feuding, whatever you describe it. Hasn't had anything to do with 25 million Australians. And, the Australians we should be focused on, above all else, are these little ones. It is the next generation that we are working for here in this place. And we have achieved a great deal. It has been, there are some things that I would have liked to have completed or done more on, but to be really honest with you, we have got so much more done in this government, and particularly in this Parliament, than I expected, and I certainly a lot more than any of you expected, as you know. So sceptics that you all are. So look, thank you all very much, and I wish you all the best. And above all, I wish the new Prime Minister-elect the very best, and his team. Thank you.
Thank you.
Malcolm Turnbull, the former Prime Minister of Australia, outgoing Prime Minister of Australia, at a media conference this afternoon. Scott Morrison is Australia's fifth Prime Minister in as many years. Home again. Parents of some Upper Hutt students are uneasy about a move to hold released prisoners in the grounds of Wanaka prison if they can't find other accommodation and self-care units. This week, the Department of Corrections sent a fact sheet outlining its decision to accommodate up to 11 such former prisoners in a former training facility that has been renamed Te Korowai, or place of shelter and care. It said they'd be homeless if they don't do this, which would present unacceptable risks to them and the community. And Marie May reports.
In its information sheet, the Corrections Department makes plain that many of those who will live in Te Korowai will have convictions for offending against children. It says that particular group of former inmates is challenging to accommodate due to community opposition. But the department's reassuring people that they will be subject to a range of measures, including GPS monitoring, regular meetings with probation staff, and restrictions on living and working arrangements. They'll also be banned from consuming alcohol and supervised 24/7. Nearby schools include St Brendan's in Heratonga and Hutt International Boys' School, a secondary college. Parents outside St Brendan's School were very concerned about Corrections' plan.
Everyone's just going to have to be that much more vigilant about keeping an eye on, all the children around here, not just their own, but, everybody's. Make sure they're in groups and just keep safe. But, yeah, it is a bit of a concern.
Yeah, I do have concerns, actually. Yeah, that they're so close to two schools, Hibbs and St Brendan's, and that they can probably freely walk out of the prison in 10 minutes. They're at two schools.
Well, I understand that people need to have a place to go, and I understand that it's a very complex and difficult issue. I'm not sure whether the way the information was distributed was the best way, leaving it up to the parents to read it and then contact them directly. I presume there would be some community meetings about such a thing?
Corrections says there are currently only 2 offenders living at Te Korowai. In a written statement this afternoon, it reiterated the fact the men would be under close supervision.
These offenders are legally allowed to leave the facility to carry out routine activities such as attending appointments. When leaving the premises, offenders must comply with strict conditions imposed on them by the courts and the New Zealand Parole Board at all times.
However, parents outside St Brendan's School this afternoon had mixed views over Corrections' ability to keep the community safe.
Yeah, I do, because going on past history, there's definitely been some concerns about whether they can monitor them properly or whether they can't, and I do have concerns about that.
I think we have to have faith in this system in regards to the way that they say that they're going to monitor them, and they only pick specific people that are going to be in that program.
Corrections run a tight unit, tight team, but it's when they're in integration and just under general supervision that things happen.
I'd hope so, but then you see cases on the news where people have been offending and re-offending. I guess they don't always get it right.
The Corrections Department says it has spoken with 21 schools and given information to over 40 early childhood centres in Upper Hutt and Stokes Valley. On its information sheet, it lists the number for its Community Liaison Advisor. In Wellington for Checkpoint, Anne-Marie May.
Let's head from Wellington to Auckland. Tears flowed at Onehunga High School today when the government announced it will spend almost $30 million to revamp the school's ageing facilities. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern and Education Minister Chris Hipkins went to the school this morning to announce $82 million in funding to replace rundown classrooms and upgrade schools in both Auckland and Northland. The money will be spent on 2 major school redevelopments and 66 new role growth classrooms across 14 schools. Amy Williams reports.
This government will be pledging $28 million to your school to see through its development as much needed infrastructure for your community. I sense that that's what's needed here.
Onehunga High School teachers and students were in tears following this morning's funding announcement. School principal Deirdre Shea says the school first started planning for an upgrade 9 years ago, and it's overwhelming to know it's finally going ahead.
It's been something that we have been working towards for many years, and to be here today and to have it announced is just so exciting.
Ms Shea says the developments will revitalise the school, and she's keen for work to begin as soon as possible.
It will give us a new gymnasium, which, as I say, we've been working towards for a long time now. It will give us a new library, and it will give us a number of new teaching spaces, probably about 16. That's a really significant change for our school campus.
Education Minister Chris Hipkins says the funding for Onehunga High School is long overdue.
I understand that Onehunga High School in particular have been through a planning process several times already, so they've got a master plan, so they're therefore keen to get underway as quickly as they can. Obviously there's consenting issues and getting a building, construction firm engaged and all of that sort of thing. But now that they've got the money, there's no central government barrier to things moving more quickly.
As well as Onehunga High School's funding boost, the Prime Minister announced Northcote College will receive $11.5 million to replace old buildings with weather tightness issues. And $43 million will be invested in new classrooms at another 12 schools in Auckland and Northland. Ms Ardern says the funding is critical.
We're also putting funding into making sure that we have enough teachers across the region to teach in the growing roles that we have. So critical investment, what's needed, and for some of these schools they've been waiting a long time for it to come.
Further government funding announcements on school property are likely to be made in the coming weeks. For Checkpoint, Amy Williams.
Well, let's head south. Thousands of eyes will be... Someone's talking in my earpiece? No. Oh, sorry, thousands of eyes. We're hoping, actually, that we're going to get Scott Morrison, the Australian Prime Minister, not to talk to him directly, but some grabs from him, although it's so far pretty pro forma stuff. But let's head to Wanaka, where thousands of eyes will be on the slopes and the sky as the Winter Games, billed as one of the world's top 5 winter sports competitions, are opening in Wanaka tonight. More than 800 athletes from around the globe have converged on the Southern Alps to compete in freestyle cross-country and alpine skiing, as well as snowboarding, curling and ice hockey. The Winter Games is ready to hit fresh heights, having just become an annual event and featuring new categories like Big Air. For the first time, our Otago Southern reporter Tess Brunton filed this report, lucky her, from Wanaka.
Skiing down the slopes of Codrona is a homecoming for Nico Porteous. The 16-year-old Olympic free ski half-pipe bronze medalist
has spent years chasing winters and competitions around the globe. That's made his return to New Zealand even more special.
It's different just because it's at my home mountain. To wake up in your own bed every morning and, you know, have your mum walk you out to the car and say, oh, good luck, and off you go. And so that's really good.
Porteous says the Winter Games will become a staple of the World Cup tour. He says hosting the Junior World Championships for just the second time is a coup for New Zealand.
It doesn't happen in any other event. To have Junior Worlds and a World Cup in the same event never happens. And so that is really cool, to have the best and the up-and-comers in the exact same environment.
New Zealand snowboarder Carlos Garcia-Knight narrowly missed out on a medal at this year's Olympics. But he's pumped to compete in his third Winter Games.
It's more than just a competition. You go out there and you're able to watch other people compete. There's so many athletes in town and there's so much going on here, and I think to have the Junior Worlds as well this year and to see everyone coming through, and for New Zealand to be the one that's holding the event, and after such a heavy Northern Hemisphere scene, I think it's an awesome thing for New Zealand.
Garcia-Knight says making the Winter Games an annual event will attract more athletes to the country.
It seems like a lot of the places that we travel to are where a lot of good riders come from, so it's nice for once to be able to have the Junior Worlds here in New Zealand, and for people that have grown up riding here to show what they can do, and then to also show the kids that are coming through kind of where the level's at and like how cool a competition could be in New Zealand.
Garcia-Knight will be competing in a new category, Big Air. Winter Games Chief Executive Marty Toomey says he expects the free ski Big Air event will be a draw card in years to come.
Being on the Olympic program means that there is no doubt that in future years we'll get the best of the best will always want to be here, because it's part of their qualification process. So, you know, we're really excited. New Zealand's pushed really hard for that to be included. So to actually be able to have it confirmed it's included on the program, and then to actually be able to host it as part of our event at home, is something pretty special.
But it's not the easiest competition to prepare for. It's taken 200 volunteers, 60 contractors and 8 senior staff members to make these games a reality. The competition has brought a $13.4 million boost to the region last year. For the athletes themselves, Marty Toomey reckons the Games will become the must-do event to qualify and prepare for the Olympics.
We'll see athletes around in the event this year that we've never seen before, that we don't know about, who will do some things that no one knew they were capable of, and will probably be standing on the podium in 2022. So that's what's exciting. We'll be able to follow them through the next 3 years and watch them as they progress to becoming medalists, and hopefully we've been a good part of their journey.
With the promise of fresh talent and snow on the horizon, the Games, which run until September the 8th, look set to become one of the biggest years yet. In Wanaka for Checkpoint, this is Tess Brunton.
From Wanaka to Hawaii, where Hurricane Lane has weakened into a Category 3 storm, but has been lashing the island chain with high winds and torrential rains, touching off flash floods, landslides and raging surf as residents hunkered down to ride out the storm. The eye of the storm is still spinning to the southeast of the Big Island and has dumped up to 400 millimetres of rain on its eastern side. There are no reports of injuries, but at least 14 roads have been closed along with schools and businesses, and authorities are warning the storm could stick around and be a real nuisance for days. The BBC's Lebo Deseko reports.
Hurricane Lane is yet to hit these islands, but the rain and winds already have. One section of the Big Island had nearly half a metre of rain in just 24 hours as the Category 3 cyclone gets nearer. Even if it doesn't make landfall, it still brings a storm that authorities say could be life-threatening.
We're extremely concerned about the potentials for inland flooding, landslides occurring, and damage to the transportation communications infrastructure. The other issue that we're going to see is that this is not just going to be over in the next 24 hours. This system is going to be with us for the next 4 or 5 days, continuing to bring winds to the island, to bring large surf, as well as the torrential rains that we've talked about.
Residents have been battening down the hatches. The governor's warned them to prepare for the worst. He says they should take the threat seriously and put aside at least 2 weeks' worth of food, water and medicines. There were long queues as people rushed to get their last few supplies. Some supermarkets say their shelves were stripped bare. Elsewhere, frantic efforts to try and defend these islands from the sea. A storm surge is expected to bring huge breaking waves, raising water levels more than a metre above normal tide levels. Only 2 hurricanes have made landfall in Hawaii since the 1950s. If Lane's centre crosses land here, it would make it only the 3rd. President Trump has declared a state of emergency, which means federal authorities will help state and local responses. In the meantime, people here are bracing themselves for some tough days ahead, with a hurricane expected to hit sometime on Friday.
The Libro de Seco reporting, just updating on Scott Morrison, who's having his first media conference. It is fairly pro forma stuff. The Liberals are going to do this, the Liberals are going to do that. We're the new face of the Liberals. He is only 50. He looks a little bit older than that, I reckon. But anyway, but interestingly, he's offering Julie Bishop and Peter Dutton senior roles, it sounds like, in his team. What do they say about politics? Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. That certainly sounds like what Scott Morrison is doing. Quite extraordinary that Dutton did all the Macbethian work. The blood is on his hands. He goes into, having had 2 cracks at Turnbull this week, he doesn't have the numbers. And Morrison sneaks through. What a disastrous coup for Turnbull and for Dutton, although, but not for Scott Morrison, who is now the Prime Minister of Australia. That's Checkpoint. What a mad, crazy day it's been. Thanks everyone for being with us. We really appreciate the privilege of your company. On behalf of Pete Peen, our executive producer Catherine Warbridge, our associate producer Bridget Burke, our brilliant getter Michelle Cook, our digital producer Zach Fleming, our reporter Calvin Samuel in the control room now, our director, oh you can't see anything because Catherine has got her arms on her hips, Jeremy Ansell, our brilliant sound guy and the head of the sound department in Auckland, and Nick Monroe, our cameraman. That's Checkpoint for the week. It's lovely having you with us, and we'll be back Monday at 5.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. The Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says sacked Cabinet Minister Clare Curran should have been transparent around an undiaried meeting with a tech specialist. After a messy leadership battle, the Australian Treasurer Scott Morrison has emerged as the new leader of the Liberal Party and the country's 30th Prime Minister. And Green Party MP Chloe Swarbrick says high suicide rates among 20 to 24-year-olds should be treated as a crisis. Our next news and weather is at 7.
This beautiful, ethereal piece of music is called The Greystone. It's taken from the forthcoming Pacific Heights album called The Stillness. And we'll speak to Pacific Heights mastermind Devin Abrams about their bold new direction. Also, we speak to Finn Andrews from The Vales about his new solo song. We speak to Interpol about their new album Marauder. And Julian Dine in for the RNZ Music Mixtape. Which show